Greetings, my name is Monty Martin.
And I'm Kelly McLaughlin.
And we are the Dungeon Dudes. Welcome to our channel where we cover everything D&D, including advice for players and guides for dungeon masters.
We upload new videos on Tuesdays and Thursdays, so please subscribe to our channel so that you never miss an episode.
Today, we are discussing our wish list for the next evolution of Dungeons & Dragons. If you haven't heard the news, at a recent D&D Celebration livestream event held in September 2021, the developers of Dungeons & Dragons at Wizards of the Coast revealed that they are working on the next evolution of Dungeons & Dragons to come out in 2024. This would coincide with both the 50th anniversary of Dungeons & Dragons, but also the 10th anniversary of Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition.
What they've announced is that there's going to be a new iteration of the core rulebooks. So we're going to see brand new rulebooks for a backwards compatible version of 5th edition. Some people are dubbing this 6th edition, or more likely 5.5, which kind of resembles the 3.5 that we got in the past. But what's important to note is that Wizards of the Coast has not called this 6th edition or 5.5 yet. So today we're going to talk about what probably won't change, what we think will definitely change, and our wish list for what we hope to see. There's a lot to discuss today, so let's get rolling.
First of all, it's important to note as a disclaimer that at this time, the details on this are very sparse. The only facts on the table are that we are getting new versions of the core rulebooks, which is the Player's Handbook, Dungeon Master's Guide, and Monster Manual. They're coming in 2024, and they're going to be backwards compatible with all the existing 5th edition products. So from this, many on the internet have speculated that this is going to be largely similar to what occurred around the mid-aughts with version 3.5, which was a update of the 3rd edition of Dungeons & Dragons, where there was a new set of core rulebooks released. They changed some things. You could still kind of use your previous books. There were some tweaks that you had to do, but by and large, if you had an adventure or a splat book for 3rd edition, it would work with 3.5 with some bumps and scrapes, but not too many. It actually was pretty smooth in the grand scheme of things.
So really, everything that we're doing today is going to be speculative, and if you're watching this in 2024 after the book has been released, this could be entirely wrong. So we're going to do our best to take educated guesses on what we think is most likely to occur here, and also just give some of our insights into what we think could be improved in 5th edition and what we'd like to see.
But once again, we are speculating. We have no insider information. These are just our best guesses at this point, and a lot can change in 3 years.
So to get started, what we don't think is going to change. First and foremost, I think it's important to say that Dungeons & Dragons is a D20 system where you roll a D20 against a difficulty challenge. That's probably not changing.
Dungeons & Dragons is married at the hip to the D20. We're not going to see anything change with going to a 2d6 system or a dice pool system, so any just kind of fundamental mechanical change like that is just not going to occur. Similarly, the 6 ability scores, strength, dexterity, constitution, intelligence, wisdom, and charisma, those aren't going anywhere. It's still going to be a class-based system, so if you're hoping for some sort of classless system, you should look at other RPGs. We're still probably going to have 20 levels. I don't think we're going to see epic levels or anything like that introduced here. And I really would be shocked if anything happened to things like armor class, hit points, or saving throws.
As we look at Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, there's a large lean into bounded accuracy and the advantage and disadvantage system, which I actually think is one of the big benefits of 5th edition. And we probably won't see a big change there. I do think that when we look at spell casting, that is pretty cemented for what we can expect from 5th edition, with spell slots and the way that spell casting progresses and the way that it generally works. Same thing goes for magic item attunement. I don't think that they're going to mess around too much there. I will say that a lot of people are hoping that they do something about concentration, but I actually think that this is a pretty important system that they're going to leave relatively untouched.
I think it's possible we could see some spells specifically change, some spells that currently require concentration not require it, and vice versa. Some magic items that currently require attunement not require it, and vice versa. But the concentration mechanic is not going anywhere, and I would be surprised if attunement went anywhere. Those do seem like mechanics that could get looked at, but I think that they're part of a really stable core. I also would be very surprised if we saw any changes to the action economy of 5th edition. There had been some talk about, maybe bonus actions should change, or maybe Dungeons and Dragons should change the way that actions are named. Like in 4th edition, we had the standard action, the move action, and the minor action. I would be very surprised if anything like that got messed around with. I feel like if that was changed, it would not be backwards compatible.
Yeah, and that's really the thing to be careful of, is they did announce that this would be backwards compatible. Yeah. So when we're looking at what probably will change and what won't change, you need to keep in mind that even if you wanted some of these things to change, it might make it not backwards compatible, and that's something that they're going to be very aware of.
Yeah, and speaking of backwards compatibility, this means that the existing subclasses that were published in things like Xanathar's Guide to Everything and Tasha's Cauldron of Everything still need to work with whatever changes they might make to the classes. And we'll talk about the classes and how they could change in a moment. But I do think that this means that the levels at which classes gain their subclass features can't change, because if that changed, it would blow the doors off backwards compatibility in a strange way. So I think we might be locked in with that. Otherwise, they would have to release a separate document telling you what to do. And in my mind, if there is a significant document that you have to read through to establish backwards compatibility, you're not fully backwards compatible. It's like backwards compatible if you read this instruction manual.
Another thing that we're probably not going to see change is adventures. We need all of the current adventures for 5th edition to still run in the new system. So hopefully that stays the same, and all of the books that you spent all your money on for all the adventures that you probably still haven't gotten around to running, because let's be honest, I own every adventure for 5th edition and I've ran 2.5 of them.
Yeah.
So those are probably still going to be used.
I mean, adventures are one of the most resilient things that can move from edition to edition, and I think 5th edition is probably the most backwards compatible with prior editions of all editions of D&D, because I've done things where I was able to run the Red Hand of Doom in 5th edition, and it was really easy to do that by just using the closest equivalent monster stat block to whatever was there. And 5th edition does enough. We've seen 5th edition convert old classic modules in things like Ghost of Saltmarsh, but by and large, you can still go to any adventure, even from another game system, and run it in D&D 5e by just ignoring the mechanics and just focusing on the natural language there. It's really easy to convert old modules to 5e, and so I expect that with any sort of shift that's still based on the core of 5e, even if you have a first printing copy of Curse of Strahd and are running it with the new rules, it's going to work. You're just going to go to the vampire stat block in the new monster manual instead of the vampire stat block in the old one.
So that's a lot of what we don't think is going to be touched much in 5th edition, but let's talk about what we are pretty sure is going to change. First and foremost, we've already seen some changes implemented with Tasha's Cauldron of Everything and the books that are coming out. So one of the major things is the way that races might transition into lineages, and the racial bonuses that you get might be dropped completely for just a flat +2/+1. This is something that I expect to see implemented as more of a concrete rule set in the new edition.
I would go even further with that, and I would say it's very likely and possible that ability score modifiers based on your character's race will just be dropped completely, and ability score generation methods such as point buy, will just be based on your flat scores. You won't have any adjustments, because fundamentally, if every single race is giving you a +1 to one score and a +2 to another score, well, let's just boost up what the standard array is, and let's just boost up what the point buy is, so that you can have total flexibility within that. It changes things slightly for rolling the dice, perhaps, but die rolling is always going to be totally random anyways, so...
We've also started to see a gradual change with the way that monster stat blocks are handled in books like the Candlekeep Mysteries or The Wild Beyond the Witchlight, and we think that this new look at monster stat blocks is going to continue and be refined and become the normal option in the new books. One of the examples to give here is in a lot of these monster stat blocks found in these books, the spells that are offered to the monsters are fully explained so that you don't have to cross-reference between books. Makes it a little easier to run at the table. I also think one thing to expect here might be a big revision to the core classes. We saw with the initial release of 5th edition that some classes came out far ahead of others. And now that we've had 10 years of playtesting all the classes, there are a few that have fallen kind of by the wayside. We've seen some great implementations to help these classes out in Tasha's Cauldron of Everything and other books, but I do think that we could just raise them all up to an even playing field.
Yeah, I think that we're still going to see the same structures in place. So we're still going to see the same spell slot progression. Maybe we'll see a tweak to how many spells per day each class gets. That would surprise me, to be honest. And classes are still going to have skills. They're still going to have proficiencies. They're still going to have saving throws. They're still going to have tool proficiencies. We might see a growth to backgrounds being a bigger impact of your character, being a more meaningful mechanical choice in some way. But a revision of each core class, probably a revision of many spells, and a revision of many feats are almost certain to occur. How big of a revision, though, these are going to be, I think is going to depend on the class.
So with all of that on the table, let's talk about our wish list. Again, now that we're moving on to the wish list, this is entirely speculative, but it is what we hope to see in this new rendition. And I think, first and foremost, let's continue the theme here with what classes do we think need the most help?
Well, I think that over the course of 5th edition, we have seen the Ranger evolve considerably. We've also seen the Warlock evolve considerably, and the Sorcerer too. Many of these classes have had the shortcomings of them addressed through new subclasses or alternate class features in Tasha's Cauldron of Everything. I actually want those alternate class features, that idea of optional features, to stick around too. I think that the progression of how these classes, the Sorcerer, Warlock, and Ranger, have been increased in potency over the course of the edition should get cemented in, and all three of them just bake that all in there.
Yeah, I think that when we're looking at baking that all in there, I do think that we've had to use subclasses and additional class features to really bring these up. I still think more work could be done on the foundations of those classes to help just raise the bar. There's one class that we think deserved the same love that these three got, but never got it, and that's the Monk.
Yeah.
Yeah. I will say I've played a Monk, and I had a blast playing a Monk. There isn't that much wrong with the Monk, but in the grand scheme of things, I think that it always falls in the middle range. You have some powerhouses out there. You have some S-tier subclasses and S-tier options, and some classes just perform phenomenally at the table. But the poor Monk always feels like they are the middleman. And I would like us to just give a bit more love to the Monk and see it raised to the same level that we've seen the attention to the Ranger and the Sorcerer.
Yeah, I think that all the classes do need some TLC overall. Many of them are already very, very strong, and there's probably a few outliers, such as specific subclasses within them that need to be toned down. The only issue there is I think that for a lot of classes, their very powerful subclasses were introduced outside of the core rulebooks. So again, with backwards compatibility, I don't think we're going to see them take another kick at the can at something like the Eloquence Bard or the Twilight Domain Cleric, because these were published in non-core source books. So unless they make the player's handbook bigger and reprint a bunch of other subclasses, which is going to make that player's handbook a much bigger book. One of the things, though, that I do think is that there were several classes in the player's handbook that only had 2 subclasses. The Druid only had 2 subclasses. The Ranger only had 2 subclasses. The Barbarian only had 2 subclasses. And I think that each class should probably have at least 3 or 4 subclasses in the core rulebook.
Yeah, when you pick something like the Wizard, you're spoiled for choice, but then you get your Ranger and your choices out of the first book were pretty lackluster. And that's something that we've seen fixed again, but we could do a bit better there. And here's one grief that I've had with some of the new implementations, a specific thing that I would love to see. Let's give all the Sorcerer subclasses expanded spell lists. The idea that we gave the new subclasses that were offered in Tasha's expanded spell list while leaving the other ones without them made a big divide between all of your options for Sorcerer. Why would you not pick the ones with the expanded spell list? Yeah, there's still a few good options out there, but now it's hard to justify not getting those expanded spell lists. I'd like to see that tweak implemented throughout all the Sorcerers.
I think the same applies for Warlocks and Rangers as well. I think that the expanded spell list feature should universally work like the Cleric feature, in that you always have the spells prepared. They're always on your list. So Warlocks, instead of making that expanded spell list more spells that you should choose from, just give them all to the Warlocks. Same with what they did with the new Sorcerer subclasses. Same with the way the Clerics already have it. It's a no-brainer of a change, in my opinion. And I think it definitely will elevate these classes up to a higher level. I also think probably Warlocks need to have an extra spell slot or two.
I think that we could make the Warlock spell slots equal to their proficiency modifier, and that wouldn't break the game. That would actually make playing a Warlock a little better.
Yeah. We could go on a lot about specific class changes, and I think that this is something that everybody has a different opinion about. So rather than getting into the nitty-gritty of that, I do think the next thing that we're probably going to see a lot of tweaks to are specific spells. I, for one, think that we're probably going to see something about counterspell change. I think that we might see some very high-level spells change a little bit. Maybe some of those ones that are a little bit more problematic. We might see some wording get adjusted in them. But by and large, I hope that in addressing the spells, we still keep some of the unique, fun, and creative spells. Don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. We got a lot of really mechanical spells that were very samey in certain editions of D&D, and I would really hope that the unique, cool spells that encourage creativity don't get turned into nothing.
And I do think while we're talking about spells, this actually ties in greatly with another thing that I think could be looked at here, and that is the way that elemental damage works and elements in general. Something that we don't see a lot in 5th edition is, when you look at elemental damage, everything's fire. It's fire or bust. Yeah, there's a few cool cold spells, and actually I do like some of them, but then when we get into spells that deal with poison or acid or other damage types, really I find that fire is kind of the reigning supreme here. And there's also a lot of creatures that have resistances and immunities, and I think we could relook at that system as well. I would love to see something along the lines of like cold damage always slows your target. Fire damage always causes burning. Like I'd like to see a way that elemental damage could be implemented in a more unique fashion that has a bigger impact on the game. If you're fighting a red dragon and you use Cone of Cold, maybe it does something more. I'd like to see this sort of idea that mixing and matching, almost like you're playing Pokemon, you have to use the right type against the right type, and you'll do something better than if you aren't using the right type. That sort of level of thought, it's extra mechanics, but I actually think it would bring a lot of meat and a lot of nuance and creativity into the way that we use spells and abilities to combat certain creatures.
I fully agree. I think at the very least, we need at least one spell of each damage type for each spell level that is unique in some way, and not just Firebolt level 1, Fireball level 2, Fireball level 3. Like, it needs to be distinct, it needs to be unique, it needs to be interesting, and we need it across the board for making all these unique. I do think as well, resistances and immunities on creatures are very binary right now. There are so many monsters that have resistance to bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing damage from non-magical weapons, and past a certain point in many games, once the characters get magic weapons, that might as well not even be there. So I think that the way monster resistances and immunities and the way legendary resistance works needs to be rethought, because as it currently is, it's a little too binary for my taste. Again, that's going to be a challenging thing to address while keeping backwards compatibility. So I don't know how that specific thing gets changed, but I want it to change.
Another thing that you've probably heard us talk about on our show is that we actually use a different standard array that actually ups the power level of the characters. Now, the reason that we do that is tied to the next thing that I think I want to see looked at, and that is feats. The reason why we up our standard array is so that characters that play with the higher standard array are more open to being able to take feats at their level increases when they would normally get ASIs. Now, if we could unattached, if we could break the ties between you have to pick either ASI or a feat, I would like to see more openness on the ability to just choose feats at certain levels.
I think that feats can be an optional rule, and we could just have a rule in there that says that characters get to pick a feat at level 2, level 6, level 12, and level 18 at the beginning of each tier of play, or something like that. Like, just have an optional rule that if you want a game that has more feats, you can do it. Alternatively, having an optional rule where feats are presented as something that characters can train for in their downtime or gain as an alternative reward would be really, really great at making feats a more interesting part of the game. Obviously, I love feats, and I think that there's a bunch of feats that need to get rebalanced. I think that much like the balance between the elemental damage types, we need to go back into Sharpshooter, Great Weapon Master, Polearm Master, and Crossbow Expert, and either there need to be feats for other weapon styles that are just as good as these ones, or these ones need to get knocked down. Probably both.
As we're talking about systems that kind of need to be brought more into the spotlight, like feats, I think that there's also an argument here. I'm a big fan of tool proficiencies, and I just want to say that I love the idea of having tool proficiencies, but it's very rare that they actually seem impactful on the game, unless they're thieves' tools or like a disguise kit. But if I have proficiency in carpenter's tools, or I have proficiency in glass blowing, other than maybe a downtime activity that I might be able to make a few gold on, we saw Xanathar's kind of try to meld some cool options in here, but I would like to see a more concrete idea of, if you have this tool proficiency, you can do X, Y, or Z. Maybe during your long rest, each tool proficiency gives you something you can do that's useful for the whole party and for the game mechanics. I want to see more solidified game mechanics that make your tool proficiencies important and make gathering tool proficiencies and practicing with them and gaining a tool set a valuable thing.
And I think ultimately, I really want close attention paid to character options. As much as we get flack for being min-maxers, and we're pretty tame as far as it comes to character optimization goes, I really don't think that the difference between the best option and the worst option should be that far. In an ideal world for me, it would be impossible to choose something that let you do more damage. It would never be a choice of what deals the most damage. It would always be a choice of what is interesting to you, and the merits of how you build your character are not... You would not have the ability to take a feat that increases your damage, because the damage level is something that is innate in the character. So yes, well, I want there to be more character options. I want there to be lots of room for creativity. I still want to be able to have fun building my character. I want to make sure that 5th edition keeps to that general mentality of making sure that the gap between a character that's chosen the best options and someone who's just been choosing the flavorful options is pretty small. And so that play at the table is more important than, picking the laundry list of, what the dungeon dude said the top 5 cantrips were.
Here's one that is on my wish list, but it's actually going to be pretty hard to implement without impacting the backwards compatibility. That is the way that challenge rating is calculated. There's been a big issue with challenge rating in the fact that I think the core problem with challenge rating is that you'll see that it's advertised that the original book advertises that you should be going through 6 to 8 combat encounters in a given adventuring day, when most parties are more likely experiencing 3 to 4.
Balancing monster challenge rating around player characters going through 6 to 8 combat encounters in a day was a mistake.
Yeah. I don't know many people that go through 6 to 8, and if you do, that's awesome. But in all of my experiences, every table that I've played at and every game that I've ran, it's more likely 3 to 4. And challenge rating for that reason is actually difficult as a dungeon master to kind of use that as a system. I have found that I am better at making combat encounters because of my experience, and I know that my level 4 players can go up against a level 10 creature and take it down. But that's kind of throwing CR out the window when you do that. Now I have to kind of equate, well, I know that they can take this creature out, and therefore CR isn't working the way it should. I'd much rather have a better system that actually advertises what I can expect as a dungeon master, so that I can say, oh yes, this creature who is CR4 should go solo against my group of level 4 characters, and it will make an interesting evening of combat.
We've discussed this a lot of times before in our other videos where challenge rating is a little bit deceptive, and the biggest loser in this whole thing are new dungeon masters or dungeon masters who are great narrative storytellers but who might not necessarily have the game design experience to recognize when a monster's challenge rating isn't necessarily going to live up to expectations. A really common example of this is we talked about how the Lich, a challenge rating 21 monster, is not really good at delivering the epic final encounter that you would expect it to. And many people, rightly so, say, well, a Lich should have minions, and they should have traps, and they should have all these adventure design conceits. And I agree, they should have all that. But then, when it comes down to it, the Lich should also be able to throw down. And so, that's the distinction to me here, where monsters need... There's something intimately satisfying about the toe-to-toe showdown between the player characters and the final boss. And we need to make sure that monsters like the Lich, like dragons, like the Tarrasque, are able to deliver on that epic final boss fight without the Dungeon Master having to bog down that fight with minions that are just there to be cannon fodder, which is, in my books, it's a boring solution. It's not... Yes, it works. It makes the combat more interesting in many ways, but sometimes you just want that final showdown.
You know what I actually loved and would like to see more of was the way that Volo's Guide to Monsters handled groups of monsters, where they would show you, like, here's a bunch of monsters of this type, here's a standard layer for these monsters, and here's some ideas on how to set up an adventure in that. If a Lich is a CR21 creature, it should have its own section in the book where it says, here's your Lich stat block, make it more powerful, make it able to throw down, but then also give it, like, here's what their layer, other than layer actions, here's what their layer should look and feel like, here's how it's filled with minions, here's things that the Lich will do to make sure that they are in a winning situation in their combat. We have a little bit of this, but I actually think that we should make it much easier for dungeon masters and basically lay out a whole concept for these high-level monsters that really deliver on this idea of here's how to make them a wonderful endgame boss.
Dungeon Masters need tools in the rulebooks that work reliably so they can focus their time and attention on building interesting worlds, building interesting NPCs, building interesting scenarios, and weaving interesting adventures. Those creative endeavors are the most important part of DMing. And every minute a Dungeon Master spends having to tweak encounter balance, fix a broken monster stat block, try to account for balance issues between player characters, cleaning up the game rules, that is time taken away from the Dungeon Master's ability to be creative. And while I do enjoy those activities as well, they can be fun, there are Dungeon Masters who don't, who feel that that work brings down the experience of being a DM. So there's a balance to it. Like all things, there is always a balance, but we should make sure that our tools for dungeon, especially as the game is growing and there are so many new Dungeon Masters, we need to make sure that the rules presented in the books work the way they say they do, because currently they don't.
And speaking of creators and dungeon masters who are setting out to create their own epic campaigns, amazing adventures, new monsters, and all of that sort of stuff, one thing that we have noticed just coming off of our first Kickstarter was I would like to see an expansion on the OGL. For those who don't know what the OGL is, it's the Open Game License. And if you are planning to publish your own adventure or your own material that is part of the Dungeons & Dragons universe, the OGL is the list of things that you are allowed to reference and allowed to use. But anything that isn't on that list, you're not allowed to use. Now, I fully understand that Wizards of the Coast wants to keep some things to themselves. But having just written our book, there were some shockers out there for us. There were things that we were very excited to put in the book. And actually, Monty had to continually message me. I would hand in a draft and be like, how about an adventure where a group of Myconids and a Banshee team up? And you had to be like, can't use either of those. Artificers, which were added later, but if we are expanding the OGL, a lot of people asked in our book, hey, none of your spells are available to artificers. Is this an oversight? No, we're just not allowed to talk about artificers in our book. Again, we worked around it and we actually got to have the joy of making a bunch of our own bespoke monster stat blocks, which was so much fun. But there were entire adventures and characters, and we wish that we could tell people what spells they should use for all of their character options, but we weren't able to do so. Even something like Hex, we aren't allowed to mention it or put it on any of our monster stat blocks.
Yeah. My biggest hope here is that Wizard of the Coast continues to do the great job they have done supporting and encouraging our overall community. There have been such an outpouring of new creations by emerging and independent creators, and there's been a space for voices to contribute to the hobby of role-playing games in a way that we really have never seen before. It's never been easier to share your work with the world, whether you're writing an adventure, creating a new class, making new spells, or just sharing your opinion on that. And I really hope that that principle stays and, if anything, gets expanded and grows.
Overall, 5th edition has been such a great implement to Dungeons & Dragons. I think that what we got to see with the initial release of 5th edition was a system that was more inviting to new people. Me as a dungeon master, I was trying to grasp 3.5, and I found it quite daunting as a brand new person jumping into the DM seat. Once 5th edition was released, I was able to jump into that DM seat no problem. Some of the ideas that we've implemented in here are really key to making it accessible and a much more fun and easygoing hobby where people can take it as seriously as they want, but people can also jump in for a fun game night with their friends. And I think that with this new implementation, I hope to see that vibe continue. I hope that we get more of what is making Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition so amazing in the first place. I think that a lot of the stuff that we talked about today are just kind of our wish list, our hopeful ideas, and some things that we've noticed could be tweaked or fixed. But all in all, I think that it's moving in a really great direction, and we're seeing a much bigger and broader audience and more diverse audience get into role-playing games. And that's really exciting. I have people that I don't know if they would have gotten into previous editions who are now asking me to play at my tables and are really enjoying the experience. And I think that that's really, really valuable. So this has been our wish list for the next evolution of D&D. Tell us some of the things you want to see in the comments below.
The videos that we create on our channel are made possible thanks to the incredible generosity of our Patreon supporters. If you enjoy the work that we do here on YouTube, please consider supporting our channel by following the links in the description below.
And don't forget to check out our live play Shadows of Drakkenheim, which airs Tuesday nights at 6 p.m. Eastern on Twitch. You can find all the previous episodes right up over here.
And we've got plenty of great advice for Dungeon Masters in D&D 5e right up over here.
Please subscribe to our channel so that you never miss an episode.
Thanks so much for watching. We'll see you next time
in the dungeon.